that's been garnered over God only knows what period of time to say, well, look, I mean, even God needed to take a break and appreciate what was going on, and it's not such a bad thing for people to follow that pattern. And that's a good thing for modern people to know, because we seem to be, even though, you know, we're very wealthy by historical standards, our capacity to relax isn't exactly what it could be, and I think that's really hard on people. Okay, so I'm going to go over again the idea of the attributes of God. I talked about that a little bit last week, but I want to return to it because I think it's worth dwelling on a little bit, because we're trying to figure out what it is that people were trying to formulate when they were formulating these representations. And we've sort of come to the conclusion that there is an attempt to abstract out the nature of power from specific aspects of power, and there's some attempt to associate that with consciousness as that which gives rise to being itself, and there's some attempt to associate that consciousness with something that has a cosmic quality, whatever that might mean, and it's a statement that it has a cosmic quality rather than a discovery. It's a mere statement that there's something about consciousness that has world-generating significance, and also the implication that it's associated with human beings as well. It's a very interesting set of propositions, and I don't believe that they're simply refutable. Like it's a perfectly coherent argument, even though it's primarily made metaphorically. And so then, once again, I want to build up the framework of associations around the idea of God. One of the things that Freud did when he was interpreting dreams, and this is quite useful, you know, so if someone comes to me with a dream, then I have them tell me the whole dream, and then I get them to repeat it line by line, and then whenever they say a line and there's an object in it or a person or something like that, I ask them what that makes them remember, or what that thing means to them, or what comes to mind. And that's the associational technique, and it's predicated on the idea that your memory works by association. And you know that if you're daydreaming, you know, you go from one thing to another like a conversation does, and that you can take an idea that's at the center of a web of associations, and by tracking the associations you can kind of zero in on what the idea might mean. And then Jung expanded that by trying to, he called it to amplify the dream, by thinking about narrative or literary or mythological similarities that might be associated with the narrative structure of the dream. And I think often that can be unbelievably useful, you know. And it's like the dream is an idea that's trying to come to birth. It's partly formulated, and then if you discuss it and amplify it, it's like you can speed along its transformation into a more articulated idea. And the dream is also something that, because your brain, your mind is trying to, with one foot in the unknown, it's trying to formulate what's out there in the unknown and to make it concrete, but it doesn't do that in one fell swoop. It doesn't just take potential and turn it into articulated ideas. It has to dream up what's out there first, projects its imagination out there to get a handle on what it might be, and then that's presented in the dream, and if you analyze the dream you can make it more articulate. And so that's what we're going to do with the attributes of God, to build up the representational structure a little bit. So the hypothesis is that God is an abstracted ideal, formulated in large part to dissociate the ideal from any particular incarnation or man or ruler. And the underlying idea there too is that when the ruler becomes the ideal, the state turns into the biblical Egypt. And the biblical Egypt is a tyranny. And so there's a very, very solid idea in the Old Testament that I think took people, God only knows how long, to figure out, that if you confused the notion of sovereignty with the current sovereign, then your culture immediately degenerated into a totalitarian state and turned to stone. And that was deadly. Then you were slaves. And then the thing was going to collapse as well. Like, no matter how big and grandiose, as soon as the ruler became the concrete incarnation of the ideal, there was no distinction between the man and the divine notion of the ideal, then the society was doomed. And I think that that's I think that's true. It's as simple as that. And I think we saw more than enough evidence of that in the 20th century, and we're certainly seeing the same thing repeating itself now. When the ruler becomes the ideal, the state turns into the biblical Egypt, and the biblical Egypt is the archetypal tyranny. So, what is God like? Well, from the Christian perspective, there's three elements. One seems to have something to do with tradition. And so that's God the Father. And that's partly the embodiment, I would say, of the human being. And that's an ancient thing. And it's also partly the embodiment of the tradition of human beings, which is also a very ancient thing. And that's the structure, as I said. It's the structure that consciousness emerges from that enables us to grapple with the unknown as such. And then there's the intermediary between that and Christ, say, that's the Holy Spirit, that's that bird. And that's the Spirit in a more abstracted sense. And I would say that's probably as close as Christianity ever got to the notion of consciousness as such. You know, disembodied consciousness, something like that. And then there's the notion of the suffering individual. And that's a very complicated idea. And it's something like, so there's this idea, an old idea, and I believe this was originally a Jewish idea, that something with the attributes of God, omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, lacks something. So it's like a Zen cone. It's a really interesting idea, because you think, well, what in the world can something like that lack? And the idea is limitation. So something that's everything lacks limitation. And that idea, like when I first encountered that, just blew me away. I thought it was such a brilliant realization that there are advantages to not being able to do things. Partly because it gives you something to do. I suppose that's a big part of it, right? Is if you had everything you wanted at every moment at your fingertips, well, there's nothing, there's no story. And it's funny, because that happened to Superman, the cartoon character. By the 1980s, he could juggle planets, and you could bounce like hydrogen bombs off him and it'd be fine. And it's like everyone got bored because, well, what were we going to do to Superman? It's like you lob a hydrogen bomb at him and he just brushes it off and like combs his hair, and that's the end of that. And the whole cartoon series basically died because he didn't have any flaws. There's no story without the limitation. And I think that's an absolutely remarkable idea. And so part of the notion of Christ, and this is something that I've puzzled over for a long time, and I learned a lot of this from Jung, is that there's idea in Christianity that there's consciousness as such, which in some sense is eternal. It stretches from the beginning of the time to the end of time, but it's this abstracted notion. But it lacks a certain kind of reality because it's not instantiated somewhere. It's not instantiated in a specific time and place in history. And so the idea of the Son, the third part of the Trinity, or one of the three parts of the Trinity, is the notion that tradition and consciousness as such also has to be embedded in history in a particular time and place. And so there's the archetypal embeddedness, and that would be the incarnation, and that's the perfect man, right, who accepts his mortality and acts in a virtuous manner. But it's the archetypal story of every individual as well. And there's a very strong strain in Christianity. I would say this is more pronounced in Orthodox Christianity, that the proper path of life is to take the tradition, let's say, and the spirit that's associated with consciousness as such, and to act it out in your life, in your own personal life, in a manner that's analogous to the manner in which Christ acted it out in his life. And what that means in part is the acceptance of the tragic preconditions of existence. And so that's partly betrayal, right? Betrayal by friends and by family and by the state. And it's partly punishment for sins that you did not commit, as well as the ones you did commit, and sometimes that's just a relief, but the arbitrary nature of justice, and also the fact of finitude. And the notion is that your duty, let's say, and the way to set things right in the cosmos is to accept that as a necessary precondition for being, and to act virtuously despite that. And that's a very, very powerful idea as far as I'm concerned. And I'm also, the world's a weird place, and I've seen some very strange things in my life. And one of the things that I've seen is that, I've dealt with some people who were very, let's say, that they weren't on a good path. Let's put it that way. And one of the things that was really interesting about being around people like that, it was like almost like they were surrounded by a gravitational field of sorts. I'm speaking metaphorically, obviously. And their worldview was so warped and twisted that if you came within contact of them, you all of a sudden started to play a part in their drama. And it was almost inevitable. They would maneuver and manipulate and interpret in a way that made you into the villain in their story, no matter what it was that you wanted to do. And unless you've encountered something like that, and many of you probably have, You don't know how powerful a pull that is. And so it's certainly possible that someone can act in a like a gravitational object and bend things around them to fit their narrative, their unhappy and tragic narrative. But I've seen the opposite too, where people who were aiming upward with the best of their ability, and because of that they had a positive effect on the people around them, and that ordered things around them in profound ways. And I think it's an open question, the degree to which the cosmos would order itself around you properly if you got yourself together as much as you could get yourself together. I mean, we know that things can go very, very badly wrong if you do things very badly wrong. There's no doubt about that. But the converse is also true. If you start to sort yourself out properly and then you have a beneficial effect on your family, I mean, first of all, that's going to echo down the generations, but it also spreads out into the community. And we are networked together. We're not associated linearly. We all affect each other. And so it's an open question, the degree to which acting out the notion the notion that being is good, and the notion that you can accept its limitations and that you should still strive for virtue. It's an open question how profound effect that would have on the structure of reality if you really chose to act it out. And I've seen things, as I said, in my life that indicate that I do believe there's a metaphysical element to life as well as the rational, practical element. And I think there are times when those two things come together, and I've seen that happen. And so I don't think we know the limits of virtue. I don't think we know what true virtue could bring about if we aimed at it carefully and practically. And so the notion that there's something divine about the individual who accepts the conditions of existence and still strives for the good, I think that that's an idea that's very much worth paying attention to. And I think the fact that people have considered that idea for at least 2,000 years quite seriously is also an indication that there's at least something to be thought about in relationship to that. So that's kind of the Trinitarian idea. Same idea there. And you see, it's interesting too, because you have God the Father, essentially, who's coming out of this strange, you see, this isn't the sky exactly, and you see this very often in these old pictures. It's not exactly the sky, whatever the heaven was that people believed in. It's something it's like the sky opens and there's a dimension beyond the sky. It's something like that. And I wanted to show you this too, just to show you that this isn't only a Western conception. And it has something to do with mystical experience, because there's a bodhisattva. It kind of looks like he has a hat, but that's not a hat. That's a whole bunch of bodhisattvas going back to eternity, right? And this hole in the sky here is like a hole into time, and these things are recurring across time. It's the eternal recurrence of this redemptive archetype, and the sky opens up, and you can see that thing recurring and recurring and recurring. Same idea is basically, that's the blue Buddha, who's a healing entity, sitting in a mandala, which is like a representation of paradise. And it's the same idea. It's like reality opens up and reveals this image of perfection. And so it's a universal conception. And I think it's a representation of the possibility of the metaphysical and the physical coming together in some sort of communication. It's something like that anyways. And I mean, you have to remember that there's absolutely no doubt that people have metaphysical and religious experiences. That's an absolute fact. You can induce them chemically. You can induce them electrochemically. Lots of people who have epilepsy have epileptic prodromas that are associated with divine enlightenment. So Dostoevsky, for example, he had epilepsy, and that was really, I think, one of the things that made him a great author. And Dostoevsky would have this feeling that he was going to have an epileptic seizure, and he said that the feeling for him was that the world was opening up and he was becoming more and more and more enlightened, and he was just on the verge of grasping the essence of existence, and then he'd have an epileptic seizure. And for the subjective feeling was that much knowledge was just too much for him to bear. Well, you can say, well, that was a neurological abnormality, and fine, but God, he was Dostoevsky, and so you can't just brush that off. So so that's the Trinitarian idea fundamentally. And this notion here is the notion that, well, the cross is a funny thing, because the cross marks the center, and it's an X, and the X is the center of the world, like the X that a cathedral is, and it's the center of the world is where you are, because as a consciousness you're the center of the world. that center of the world is a place of betrayal and suffering and limitation. That's exactly what it is. And the question is, well, given that, and given the fact that you know it, what the hell are you supposed to do about it? And what that representation, I believe that's Goya, what that representation implies is that you're supposed to voluntarily accept that and then move forward. Well, in good faith and with courage, that's the notion. And that you're supported. You're supported by your tradition, and that's why you need your tradition too. That's why you need to be embedded in your tradition, because without that, without the support, let's say, of your father, and I mean that both practically and metaphysically, without that behind you, without the knowledge of you as both a biological and a cultural creature, without that depth of knowledge, you don't have the courage to do it. Because you don't know what you are, what you could be. And so without that, because you're a historical creature, you know what, students ask me sometimes, why study history? It's like, well, because history is about you, that's why. It's like, history tells you who you are. You can't tell who you are because you only live a little while. How the hell can you figure out who you are? So you need all this collected wisdom and all this dream-like information and all this mythology and all this narrative to inform you about what you are beyond what you see of yourself. And you know, you're pummeled down and people picked on you and there's 50 things about you that are horrible, and you know, you've got a self-esteem problem and you're sort of hunched over and you've got all these problems, you know, and so it's not easy to see, let's say, the divinity that lurks behind that unless you're aware of the heroic stories of the past and the metaphysics of consciousness, let's say. I don't think that you can have the courage to regard yourself as the sort of creature that can stand up underneath that intense existential burden and move forward in courage and grace. And of course, that's part of the reason that I'm talking about these biblical stories, and it's 9:30, so we're going to have to stop. Okay, so we're going to stop exactly at 10 tonight, because that's the deal with the theater people. And so, and besides, I'll be out of anything intelligent to say by that point, certainly. So, well, at least we got through one story, so that was good. So, yeah. Okay. Let's give everyone like just a few seconds to settle down. And everyone who wants to leave can leave. So thank you for all for coming, by the way. I'm constantly amazed that everybody comes and listens to this, because it's just, well, it's strange. Let's put it that way. So far it's been fun though, so that's good. So okay, let's go.
Hi. Oh, that works. Hi, Dr. Peterson. I was raised Catholic, and anytime there was a bit of an inherent contradiction, let's call it, in the documents of the Bible, it would be referred to as a mystery. And there's one mystery I've always kind of wondered about, and it's very important to Genesis. How do you deal with a perfect God, or the conception of a perfect God, who by nature is incapable of an imperfect design, or incapable of a perfect design? So what I mean by that is many religions present, for example, good and evil as separate deities that pre-existed simultaneously. What's interesting about Christianity is that Lucifer, the embodiment of evil in the Christian religion, is an outgrowth of God, and is sometimes, Milton, for example, presents him as a rebel against his interpretation of God's tyranny, right? Another example, we didn't touch on Eden today, but in paradise, a supposedly perfect garden, a perfect design, is infiltrated again by that evil outgrowth of a so-called perfect God. So from a psychological perspective, do you think there's a significance to this presentation of perfection, yet the contradictory flaws that are sort of naturally part of that perfection, quote unquote?
Oh, so good. That's a good, simple question.
We're starting good.
See, Carl Jung, he was kind of Manichaean in his approach, and he tended towards thinking that evil, in some sense, was a separate entity. And I thought about that for a long time, because there's a potency about evil that just can't be brushed away. And I mean this most practically, as I've said, like for people in my clinical practice, I've dealt with many people who are touched by malevolence, and there's no other way of stating it properly. And this happens a lot to people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. Like, they encountered someone that wanted to hurt them for the sake of hurting them. You know, it wasn't some misunderstanding. You can forget about that. It wasn't that at all. And so to deny the reality of evil in some sense, I think, is the ultimate in naivety, even though it's a word that you won't hear used, for example, very often in universities anymore. But I just can't understand that at all. But I thought about that a lot, and so I'm going to kind of answer that question by hitting it scattershot. The first thing is that there's an idea, and this happens in Milton, that comes across in Milton, that distance from God is hell. Right? That hell doesn't actually have any, I mean, no, it's ambivalent in Milton, but the fundamental claim seems to be that the farther you get from God, the more it's hell. And then there's another idea that Milton's Satan, who's Lucifer, the bringer of light, right? He's God's highest angel, gone most wrong. And I kind of think about him as the spirit of rationality, of intelligence. It's not because I'm not an admirer of intelligence, because hooray for intelligence, but one of the things that Milton seemed to cotton on to before the rise of modern totalitarian states was that intellect has the capacity to fall in love with its own creations and to elevate them to the highest place, which is basically a totalitarian claim. It's like, what I know is everything that needs to be known, and if it was only manifest in the world would become a utopia. And I also think that's, and we'll talk about this next week, I also think that that's the core idea behind the Tower of Babel. Remember, the Tower of Babel is raised by human beings so that the pinnacle will hit heaven. And so it's the idea that we can build a structure that makes the transcendent unnecessary. And so, okay, so there's those two things. Then there's an idea of free will that's associated with it too. And it seems to me that in order for there to be good, there has to be evil. And so I think the answer is something like this, is that in order for there to be being, there has to be limitation. In order for there to be good, there has to be the possibility of evil. I think the right path is to exist such that the possibility of evil remains open, but that you choose the good. And I don't think that evil per se is built into the structure of the world. I do think that that's human. I think that evil is human. And I think it's understandable. I did a lecture that's online about the distinction between evil and tragedy. And tragedy seems to be built into the structure of the world, and perhaps you can blame God for that. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that it's your fault that there are earthquakes, for example. But it is not obvious to me either that it's tragedy that takes the spirit out of people. I think that human beings are actually equipped to deal with tragedy, but we're not equipped to deal with malevolence. That destroys people. And so I think that metaphysically speaking, the world is structured so that people have a choice between good and evil. So then the next question is why do we have a choice? And that's where my knowledge runs out. Like the alchemists, for example, speculated that, and the Orthodox Christians also follow this line of reasoning, is that human beings in some sense are furthering creation by our actions and by our choices. And I think there's something to that. It's like creation is unfinished in some sense, and that we're participating in moving it in whatever direction it is that we want to move it. And part of that is that we have free will, and part of that is that we have the choice between good and evil. And that's also all associated with the significance, maybe the cosmic significance of our lives. And that strikes me as plausible. And I think the weight of responsibility that people feel existentially is an indication of that. So that's about the best I could do with that. So.
And it seems the way you're describing it, it's built into at least the text that you presented, because one of the other things I'd noticed was God consistently describes creation as good, right? Mm-hmm. He creates light, it's good. He creates dark, it's good. Oh, okay. After he creates things, he announces that he creates man and woman and announces that they have dominion over those things and can use them.
Yes.
And it might be something lost to translation, but that is described as very good. Yes. As soon as that dominion is brought into existence,
yes, right, exactly.
It might speak to that notion of furthering
yes,
creation.
Well, and here's something interesting too, and we'll develop this a lot, is that, you see, when Adam and Eve eat the fruit, the snake gives them the fruit, the first thing that happens is their eyes are opened, okay? And to me that means that, well, they've woken up, right? There's been an increment in their consciousness. And the next thing that happens is that they recognize that they're naked. Okay, and to recognize that you're naked is to recognize that you're vulnerable. And human beings are strange creatures, because most animals are like this, and they're protected, but not us. Like, our most vulnerable parts are displayed for harm and for everyone to observe, right? So we've got that sort of bipedal self-consciousness built into us. But what's really interesting is that when Adam and Eve realize that they're naked, it's the same moment that they know the difference between good and evil. And God, I just ground away on that for years, trying to figure, what the hell what's going on here? What's the relationship between consciousness, knowledge of nakedness, and the knowledge of good and evil? And then I think I figured it out. I think it was that, you see, when you know that you're vulnerable, and they also develop knowledge of death, right? So there's deep knowledge of vulnerability, and they get embarrassed about that. They cover themselves up, right? So that's culture. So it's a very profound shock for them to recognize that they're naked. It even makes Adam hide from God. And then they develop the knowledge of good and evil. Well, I think it's because, you see, human beings have this peculiar capacity that no other creature has, which is, I know how I can be hurt. Because I'm aware of my own limitations, painfully aware. And now, because I know how I can be hurt, I know how you can be hurt. And I can take advantage of that. And that's, I think, how evil enters the world. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, I've got this expansion of knowledge. It says in Genesis that gives people another attribute of divinity, knowing the difference between good and evil. It has nothing to do with animals, and it has nothing to do with Adam and Eve prior to having their eyes opened. But the cosmos switches when that self-consciousness manifests itself. And that's when the possibility of evil enters the world. It's something like that. And that's also echoed by the intimate relationship between the snake in the Garden of Eden and Satan, which is, we'll go into, because that's a very strange association. It's like this snake also becomes the adversary of being. And I think that's, I'll jump very quickly into that, but I think that's because, you know, there's the snake that bites you in the jungle, and then there's the snake that lives in your enemy, and then there's the snake that lives in your family if you've banished the enemy to the Netherlands. And then there's the snake that lives in you if you remove yourself from your family. And that snake that's in you, right, that's a psychological phenomena. That's equivalent to transcendent evil itself, the thing that inhabits every single person. That's why there's that association between the snake and Satan. And that's why I think that people have this, it's associated with our knowledge of vulnerability that gives us this constant capacity for evil. I mean, imagine if you're a medieval torturer. You know, I mean, people don't generally imagine that sort of thing, but people were medieval torturers, and they were very good at what they did. And the only way that you can be a torturer is to know what would hurt you, right? And so you exploit your own vulnerability, you exploit the knowledge of your own vulnerability to bring pain into the world. And I don't think that you can lay that precisely at God's feet. Now, people have been arguing about that for a very long time, but my question, the question for me that arose from that is, all right, fine, like tragedy, you can lay that at God's feet. Well, if we didn't bring additional evil into the world, could we tolerate the tragedy of being without becoming corrupt? And I think generally the answer to that is yes, because I've seen people react quite heroically to the arbitrary burdens of their life. But malevolence, man, that lays them low. It lays them low, and it seems to be nothing but a destructive force. And I do believe as well, and I think you see this in the Cain and Abel story, that the root of malevolence is the desire for revenge against God for creation itself. And I mean, I've read terrible things written by terrible people trying to get to the bottom of things, and I mentioned the Columbine killers, for example, and it's clear, all you have to do is go read what they wrote. What they were doing was taking revenge against God. They knew that. It wasn't unconscious. They'd been dwelling on this for months, plotting their revenge. And it was revenge against being itself for the crime of being. So.
Thank you.
Hi, Doctor. You'd said when God saw that it was good, you read that as potentially, well, it might be better than nothing. And the story in Genesis, it's bracketed by days, which aren't necessarily literal days, yom, the original word, you know, but it's also bracketed by, and he saw it was good, you know, at the end of the day. So my question is there something more profoundly happening there between this profundity of speaking into existence, the way, you know, the start is, to this observation, this seeing that it's good. And is God modeling consciousness? Is there a little more there for us to grapple with?
Okay, so more for us to grapple with in what way?
In the sense that we have this insight of speaking things forth, but you'd also commented on consciousness as until something's observed, or until it's seen. So when God sees that creation was good, is there kind of this bracketing between the bringing forth through through the word, through Jesus?
Okay, that's good. I see what you mean. Okay, well, I think what that is that so it's perfectly reasonable from an archetypal and psychological perspective to consider the idea of the word equivalent to the spoken truth. I mean, Christ makes that claim in the New Testament, that he's the truth, right? And embodied. And so then logically you can derive from that the idea that if things are spoken into being through truth, then they're good. And so, yeah, I think that association exists. And I think I also think that's in some sense the deepest claim of faith. I believe that because I think you have to make a decision in your life, as far as I can tell, and I think Kierkegaard knew this more clearly than anyone else I've ever read, and that is that if being is good, then an honest relationship with being also has to be good. And then if you have an honest relationship with being, then you're going to speak the truth. And then I think what you have to decide is that if you speak the truth, then what happens is good, regardless of what happens. And that's the rub of faith, and I think that's something that Kierkegaard wrestled with, And I'm trying to think if I can provide an example about that, and easily and quickly. Well, I guess it's partly because you can live your life two ways. You can use your language to manipulate. You can use your language as a tool to get what you want. But the problem with that is that assumes that you know what you want and that you're right. And that's a problem because there's lots of things you don't know. And if you get what you want, you may find A, that you didn't really want it, and B, that you're not the person that started the journey towards that. That happens a lot to people, especially when they use their language in a manipulative way. And so the alternative seems to be, and I think this is one of the lessons, for example, that's laid out in the movie Pinocchio, which happens to be a kind of archetypal favorite of mine, is that part of the act of faith, let's say, and I wouldn't say Christian faith necessarily, I would say faith in being itself is the decision. It's like the decision that God is good. The decision is, there's no better way to bring better being into being than to speak the truth. And I do think that's echoed. I think that's a very wise observation. I think that's echoed in that first story. First of all, the act of speech, and second, the observation that the consequence was good. So yeah.
Thank you.
Good morning, Citizen Peterson. First, I have a bunch of questions and I want to have them answered immediately. Like, you have a post on Quora in which you encourage all children to incur skateboarding injuries. but also stated in this post, you wrote that do not try to rescue someone who does not want to be rescued, and be very careful about rescuing someone who does. And can you reconcile this with what you stated about transcendent morality and the heroic impulse that I guess men are supposed to be born with?
Okay. So, well, the skateboarding question is, I have a book coming out in 2018 called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And one of the chapters in there is from that Quora posting, and it's called Don't Bother Children When They're Skateboarding. And it's sort of associated with what I had said earlier about parkour, for example, is that, kids need to go out and push themselves against danger, because that's what life is pushing yourself against danger. And when you see kids doing things that are dangerous but spectacular, then you kind of have a moral obligation to back the hell off and let them experiment with their own mortality, because you can't keep them safe. The best thing you can do is make them able and courageous. And I would say that that's a more difficult lesson, generally speaking, for mothers to learn than for fathers to learn, and that was Freud's fundamental observation, but it's absolutely crucial. And so I've seen kids do, I mean, you know, you can obviously be a fool on a skateboard, although the distinction between being a fool and developing yourself is not as clear as people might like to imagine. And when kids are out there with no helmet and doing dangerous things, it's like there's a part of me that of course is very worried about it, but there's another part of me that admires it very much because they're practicing what they need to practice in order to cope with the world. Okay, so there's that. Now, the other one was rescuing people. Yeah. Well, I got this partly from Carl Rogers, you know, because Rogers he's a clinician, a very famous clinician, and he was a Christian missionary to begin with, but he didn't end up that way. But he was very interested in the utility of listening as a means of redemption, essentially. And listening, by the way, is if you have someone that you know that has a problem, the best thing you can often do is listen to them, if they're actually trying to communicate, because people configure themselves through speech. And most people can't think, and I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean the way they think is by talking, and they can't talk unless they have someone to talk to. And it's partly because they're bouncing the idea off them and seeing if it makes sense and seeing how the person responds. So listening is a great thing. But Rogers was also interested in the preconditions for having a redemptive relationship, and that could be a therapeutic relationship or an intimate relationship. And one of the things he claimed was that unless the person was aiming upward, there was nothing you could do about it. And that seemed to be associated with this idea of that initial choice, say, between good and evil. See, once someone comes to therapy, they've already done something. They've already said, I have a problem, conceivably I could fix it, and I need to do something about it. And then, so half the work is already done by the time they show up, because they've already said, well, things aren't as good as they could be, and I could do something about it. The question is, can you do anything about someone who isn't at that state? And my observation, and this is Roger's observation as well, is that you can't. I think you can serve by example, but until the person has decided on their own that they're wrong, and that's why they're suffering, that there's something wrong about what they're doing, and that they want to fix it, I think that even trying to hammer against that often makes it worse. So, and I know that Solzhenitsyn, when he was talking about the communist ideologues, the really hardcore communist ideologues that were eaten up by the Gulag Archipelago system, you know, sort of devoured by their own, he saw the same thing, was that until they were willing to admit that something was wrong with the manner in which they had construed the world, that it had resulted in their own demise, that there was actually no way of communicating with them. They're in kind of an authoritarian bubble. And so I don't think that...
So even if you orient yourself as an archetypal hero, there's no way you can get through that barrier that
Well,
they
I
put
think
up?
that that's part of the issue of free will. I do not think that people can learn unless they admit that they're wrong. There's this play, The Cocktail Hour by T.S. Eliot, and he has this woman in the play, and she comes up to a psychiatrist and she says, just in the course of casual conversation, she says, I really hope there's something wrong with me. And of course the psychiatrist is a bit taken aback by that, and he says, well, why in the world would you hope such a thing? And she says something like, well, like, I'm suffering, man, things are not good for me, I'm having a dreadful time of it, and as far as I can tell, there's only two possibilities. Either the world in its essence is conspiring against me and I'm doomed, because what am I going to do about the world? Like, it's just built into the structure of reality, or I'm doing something wrong. So I'm really hoping that I'm doing something wrong, because if I am, then maybe I could fix it and I'd stop suffering. And it's something like that. And see, it's also, I think that if your life isn't what it could be and you're suffering, then it seems to me that that should be sufficient evidence that you don't know enough. And if that isn't sufficient evidence that you don't know enough, then I don't know how anyone else could provide you with that evidence. And so I'm going to leave it at that.
This is psychological rescue, not like rescuing someone who's drowning, for example?
Yes, you can rescue people when they're drowning, even if they don't want you
Perfect.
to. I'll tell you something about that, though. Something interesting about that, and that's relevant, is that, you know, I don't know how many of you know how you rescue someone who's drowning. You do it like this, right? You come to them like this, and you push them away with your foot. If they're, I'm telling you, that's what you do if you're a lifeguard, because if they're panicking and they grab you, you both drown. And that's stupid, because then you both drown, right? And so, and that's a really good way, that's a really good metaphor for trying to help someone too. It's like when people are in real trouble, you know, some of it's they're confused and some of it is that their life has collapsed around them, and there's some malevolence there, and there's some desire for vengeance. It's just like one dangerous mess. And if you're going to wade in there unprepared, the probability that they're going to take you down compared to you elevating them is very, very high. You know, because you don't even know what your damn psychological stability rests on. You might be saying just because you're lucky and surrounded by sane people, that doesn't mean that you have the psychological wherewithal to really pull someone up from the depths of the underworld, especially if they've also got one foot in hell. So you should bloody well be careful about doing that kind of thing. It's hubristic to attempt it, and I would definitely caution people very carefully about trying to rescue someone who doesn't want to be rescued. It's very dangerous activity, and it can easily be counterproductive.
Okay, so since 2006, I've been trying to figure out, extract the meta, the way you put it, of social justice warriors. And I think I found it, actually. They seem to have this behavior where they nebulize every standard we have. So they take a standard you have that has full of criteria. They say what something is how it is. Like, that's a podium, but it has these criteria within it that make it. Oh, sorry. They take, they do something called nebulization, where they take something, a what, and they dissolve the criteria such that there is no way to say how it is. So you see this now with gender, where someone will say they're a gender, but there's no way to get logically from how they can be that gender, like how you can be an attack helicopter, a male or a woman or something like that. But the thing that came from this, and I figured this out when I learned about you, is that nebulization appears to be the exact opposite process of individuation. It's the philosophical version of individuation that rests on three premises or three core axioms, which is I exist, which is an axiom that exists in the objective, that you exist here. And then I am, which is a reiteration or reincarnation of I exist, which is, well, basically you have to say I'm right about having existed or else it just falls apart. And then you have as, which is the question begged from that. Well, if you exist and you're right, as what? And you're talking about God being the metaphor of God in Genesis being a metaphor for the creation of consciousness. And it appears that individuation actually fits that triad. Because if you take as, for example, the as it's the predictive aspect, where you try to take the subjective and make it objective. So you have an idea, you test it in reality, and time is the ultimate arbiter that determines these things. And it changes your understanding of reality. It lets you know God. It lets you know the objective. And then from that point, there's the subjective, which is supposed to be formed from objective reality. But because you've changed that, you now have to sacrifice your old self. The old way you saw Jordan Peterson of 10 years ago was not who he is now. So it gets sacrificed. And at the same time, you can point back to that guy, that Jordan Peterson, and say, well, that guy was wrong. And that's the scapegoating of the Son. So the subjective aspect, the I am right, is the Son, and then the Holy Spirit, which is supposed to lead you to God, is the as. And
Okay,
then,
I don't understand the relationship between that and the first part.
Go.
So can you just clarify that? The social justice aspect and the nebulization.
Oh, the social justice is the exact opposite process of individuation. That's all it is. And it actually occurs at as. If you're at as and you're thinking, well, what am I? You either apply individuation, you try to apply criteria, you try to find out what you are in reality, or you refuse that paradigm and say, well, look, I'm always going to be right, I'm completely self-righteous, and you stop at that subjective aspect, where everything becomes subjective and you ultimately become relativistic and nihilistic. So I'm asking, have you considered that the Genesis tale and the creation myth and God is actually the process of individuation, and the Trinity is actually those three core premises, the three axioms that come from that.
Okay, I haven't considered that. I mean, I know that Jung drew a parallel between the idea of the passion, for example, and the development of human individuality. And so there's that idea is lurking inside the Jungian notion of individuation, because it has to do with voluntary confrontation with mortality and also with evil, right, as two of the key elements of genuine self-realization. I haven't considered the metaphorical pathway that you just described, so I can't comment on that. I'd have to think about that. But I could say that one of the things that does disturb me about the ideological battle that's going on right now, and I think this is a very deep part of it, and this is the part that's a battle against the logos in Derrida's old terms, right? The phallogocentric West needs to be taken down to its essence, is the refusal to engage in precise language. And I see that in part, for example, manifested in the refusal of the people who I'm criticizing to ever engage me in any debate. They don't believe in debate, and they don't believe in the let's say, the redemptive power of dialogue, because mostly what they believe in is power. So there's a nebulization in that manner. There's this tendency to hide behind what's vague and fog-like instead of making things sharp and clear and crystalline. And I do think that that's part of the degeneration of a civilization as far as I'm concerned. So
So you haven't considered that then?
No.
Not yet. Would you please?
I'll do my best. I'll do my best.
Please.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Okay, so this is it. One more question, and then
I'll make it
yeah.
quick.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. My question is, I know you stated in the last lecture that the importance for setting aims in life
Yeah.
and to kind of have goals to work towards, right? So my question was, how do you do that if you don't know where you want to go? Because that's kind of where I got stuck on your future authoring program.
Yeah,
because
yeah. Okay, that's a good question. That's a really good question. I think it's echoed to some degree in the structure of the biblical stories, and in this manner. So there's this notion in the Old Testament that morality is following a sequence of prohibitions. There's a bunch of bad things you shouldn't do, and then basically you're good enough. And I think there's wisdom in that. I think that's kind of where children start, right? I mean, I love children and all that, but they're crazy little creatures, and they need to be, civilized. And partly what you do is you lay prohibitions on them, and mostly what you're trying to do is lay prohibitions on them for the behaviors that, if they manifested, would make their life miserable. So I have another chapter in this book that I'm writing called "Don't Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them." And the idea there is that your job as a parent is to help your children become the sort of 4-year-olds that adults genuinely smile at when they come into a room, because that makes the entire social environment both truthful and welcoming. And so your job is to make them desirable social beings, and a lot of that is prohibition. Okay, and there's this ethical transformation. It happens to some degree in the tradition of in the prophetic tradition, where there's a spirit that seemed, in some sense, to rise above the law. But there's a real transformation between the Old Testament and the New Testament, because the Old Testament is prohibition, and the New Testament is, well, here's the good things you do once you're more than merely prohibiting yourself from impulsive sin, let's say. There's a positive good to be accomplished. Well, you might say, well, I don't know what the positive good is. Fair enough, man. So this is why this thing that I've said to people has become this crazy internet meme, but that's to clean up your room, and which is a lot better and more useful than people think. It's a lot harder too, but the first thing you do, I think, and I learned this in part from Solzhenitsyn when he was trying to iron out his soul when he was in the Gulag, because he was trying to figure out how he got there, how he contributed to how he got there. Not Stalin and Hitler, even though they were kind of to blame, but there wasn't much he could do about that. I think what you have to do, and this is part of humility, is you have to look around you within your sphere of influence, like the direct sphere of influence, and fix the things that announce themselves as in need of repair. And those are often small things, and they can be like your room. Put it in order, because the thing is, it isn't exactly so important that your room is in order, although it is. What's important is that you learn how to distinguish between chaos and order, and to be able to act in a manner that produces order. And in most households, there's 100 things that could be done to just make it less hideous and horrible. And so practicing that it's a real useful form of meditation, and it's also, I think it's a divine act, because you're taking chaos. And if you pay attention even to a room, it's so interesting. And I learned, because I've renovated many places now and tried to make them beautiful. And one of the things that I've really learned is that even if you own a structure, unless you've investigated all the nooks and crannies and cleaned them up and put your own imprint on them and made them yours, they're not yours. The mere fact of physical ownership doesn't make them yours. You have to establish a dynamic relationship with the objects before they're actually yours. And I think you can do something as simple as just sit on your bed and think, okay, there's probably like 5 things I could do today so that tomorrow morning is slightly better than this morning was, or at least I'm not falling behind. And those will usually be, it's like having to eat a toad in the morning, right? It's like, it's not going to be something you want to do. There'll be things you're trying to avoid. They're snakes, essentially. But if you ask yourself, like you're asking someone, which I think is a form of prayer, if you ask yourself, instead of telling yourself, you know, what is it that I could do to set things more right today that I would actually do? It's usually some small thing because you're not that disciplined, you know. Then you can go do it. And then you put the world together a little more when you do that. And that spreads out. But you also construct yourself into something that's better able to call order forth from chaos. And that makes you just incrementally stronger. And then the next day, you can maybe take on a slightly larger task. And like, you get the benefit of compound interest if you do that. It's a tremendously powerful technique. And I think if you do that, at some point, instead of just having to fix things up that are not good, you'll start to get a glimmer of the positive things that you could do, you know, the positive things that you could do that would actually constitute a vision. And that's what I would recommend.
Thank you.